And I just want to say we will be traversing some difficult topics here tonight. Written for various publications from the New York Times, GQ, Vogue, and edited various books. Then she went on to work for Anthony Bourdain and worked for him as his assistant for 9 years until his death by suicide in 2018. During all of this time, Laurie herself was really using, what we say, drugs, alcohol, sex to get over all the things to do with the job, motherhood, marriage. Yeah. And last year she released a book about her life, which brings in Mario and Anthony, obviously, but also talks about her own journey, called Care and Feeding. One of the things that really struck me, Laurie, is that you weren't doing a lot of care and feeding for yourself. You were doing a lot of it for others for a lot of that time.
Well, I think there's a number of factors. I think there are always a number of factors for someone who is on a path of self-destruction like I was. I think there's a genetic component to alcoholism and addiction in general. There are a lot of cultural and societal pressures if one wants to submit to them, which I definitely wanted to submit to those pressures as a young person. I really enjoyed drinking and using drugs and acting out. And I think that I can say now with a little perspective that I thought if I could self-destruct, if I could cause harm, if I could make myself sick or feel pain, then I would have no choice but to take care of myself. If I would drink to excess and be sick and have to call out sick from work, then I would be allowed to take a day home on the couch and make myself feel better. And it sounds irrational, and I don't live that way anymore, but I really think that was part of what was going on was destroy yourself so that you have some reason to try and build yourself back up.
And reading the book, it really struck me that kitchens are perhaps hotbeds for self-destructive behaviour. And when you think about it, you're in the dark, your circadian rhythms are not great because you're working at night. There's alcohol involved because you're serving alcohol and then you're knocking off at 1 a.m. or whatever. How much do you think that contributes? You're literally in this dark, sweaty hole for 7 or 10 or 12 hours.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The hospitality industry really exacerbates one's tendencies to want to self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. It's a way to blow off steam with your colleagues, and it can be really fun and it's really becomes the social engine for getting along with your colleagues, for blowing off steam. There's easy access to alcohol. You don't have a lot of time to have a social life outside of a restaurant, so this becomes your whole world. And it's the work is hard, it's hot, it's sweaty, it's dangerous, pay is not great, and yet there's something really almost addictive about the work itself. There's such a sense of pride and of accomplishment of finishing a difficult shift or even an easy shift in a restaurant. To orchestrate a full dinner service in a restaurant is really no easy feat.
Yeah. You also talk about, I guess, your addiction at the time to casual sex and boyfriends who weren't good for you. I think one of them that really stuck in my mind was someone who wanted you to drink gin from the dog bowl, which luckily you didn't do. Yeah. But it struck me that we're used to those kind of memoirs from men, but we don't often hear about it from women. Mm-hmm. Is that because we don't do it as often, or because we want to be nice girls and we're trained to be good and not to show that side of ourselves? Because you've probably thought a lot about that. It's rarer, isn't it, for someone to write about that side of their life?
Yeah, I think that it's becoming somewhat more common, at least from my perspective in the States. I think there have been some very good recent memoirs of women talking about their transgressions, but I think it is a very gendered subject. I think that when men write about it, it tends to be, well, he's just having an adventure, and boys will be boys and men will be men, and it's a little bit of a wink and a nod. Whereas women myself included, tend to write about it with a great deal of shame and a great deal of self-loathing and self-flagellation. I'm not saying that my behavior was great or that I didn't have shame about it, but I think the storytelling around it has traditionally been broken up in that way. You know, it's not as much in the literary tradition to be the Jezebel. I think it's for the Jezebel to tell her own story, I think, is a relatively new phenomenon.
And how did you grapple with that? With your ex-husband still alive, your son is now 17. I think you said your mother had died, which made it a bit more possible. But what kind of things did you think about in terms of what to include and perhaps what not to include?
Yeah, I wanted to, at the top of the list was to be honest, to be brutally honest about myself, not to make myself into any kind of hero or any kind of victim, but just to be really straightforward about what was going on in my mind, the decision making or, you know, the lack thereof, the desires that I think a lot of people have in monogamous relationships, to tell those stories. I think that lots of people have lots of struggles and doubts in relationships, and many people don't choose to act out the way that I did, but some do. So I wanted to be careful to be fair to myself, to everyone that I interacted with. I wanted to protect people's privacy, obviously. I had a very good piece of advice from my editor when I sent in a first draft, and she said, you know, a little goes a long way. You don't need to tell every single story. You don't need to, give us every single encounter. It gets a little bit repetitive, and, really focusing on the ones that move the narrative forward. She said, there's a lot of vomiting in this draft. Can we dial back the vomiting by, we get it. And it's not really fun reading. So keeping the audience top of mind, or the readership rather, making sure that the narrative keeps moving and doesn't dwell too deeply on one subject. And I tried to protect my son's privacy, my ex-husband's privacy. There's a lot of changed names in the book and some obscure details. I don't want anyone else to feel exposed or hurt by the things that I've written. The specific details of who the people are isn't really important. It's how the story unfolds.
And have you noticed, the book's been out for a year, have you noticed any difference in either gendered responses or generational responses?
Yes. I have mostly heard from women directly, not entirely, but I would say 75 to 80% of the responses that I've gotten about the book have been from women saying there's something in your story that's very relatable to me, whether it's dealing with drug and alcohol addiction or workplace sexual harassment or doubts within a marriage, career struggles around motherhood, certainly the postpartum depression that I wrote about briefly. I think that really resonated with a lot of people. I've also heard, some very kind things from men who struggled at work, who have struggled with addiction, relationship issues. I mean, these are not limited to one or the other gender. I will say that I have not engaged with commentary at large. I know that it can be a very unsavory story, and there's a lot of bad behavior, and I'm not the most likable narrator that anyone's ever encountered on the page, and so I'm sure that there are some people that didn't like the book or found it repulsive or wanted to know more about Anthony Bourdain and less about me, and those are all valid responses, but to protect myself, I have not engaged with those. And as far as the generational difference, I have heard from a few folks older than me, in particular one in a book club. I was invited to appear at a book club where they had read my book. It was alumni of my university. And there were several women there who were quite a bit older than me. And one woman said, well, I just found this disgusting. I could barely get through it. I was just repulsed by you. I was repulsed by your behavior. I mean, she was extremely blunt. And it was not the easiest thing to hear, but she's entitled to her opinion. I appreciated that she showed up, that she was willing to say these things to me to my face. And she did finish the book. She did the homework, so give her credit for that.
Good book club
Yeah.
member. Your husband, you write when he discovered something that you'd written, which was very clearly what you'd done, said you better not effing be putting this in a book or be writing about this. How did you kind of grapple towards thinking, I'm going to do that anyway?
Yeah, I mean, even the minute he said, you better not be writing about this, I was like, I'm writing about this. I knew that I couldn't write about it right away. And I certainly had no perspective in that moment, when our marriage was imploding, when Tony had just taken his own life, when everything was changing and I didn't even know who I was. That was not the time to be writing about it. But I filed away for myself the right to write about it. It was my life, my story. And this is the book that I've always wanted to write. I felt that if there was one project that I'm going to do in life, it's telling this story, which I think is very relatable. There's just a lot of themes that I felt would be useful and relatable to people.